The paradox began with a silence broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. On the battlefields of Europe in 1944, American infantry huddled in foxholes, gnawing on hardtack biscuits that splintered like stones in their teeth. Their rations, officially labeled K rations, were little more than dense crackers, a few cigarettes, and a tin of processed meat spread. Men wrote home that the bread crumbled to dust in their hands, that coffee powder turned to sludge in cold water, that the hunger sat heavier than the rifle they carried. Some joked bitterly that they envied stray dogs sniffing along village ruins, now cut sharply, as if the film itself wanted to jolt the viewer. Beyond the barbed wire of a prisoner of war camp in the American Midwest, steam curled upward from a vast iron pot. German captives lined up, clutching metal trays, and into those trays, ladles fell thick stew, not watery soup, not scraps of bone and cabbage, but hearty portions diced beef, potatoes, onions, carrots softened to sweetness by long boiling. Fresh bread loaves, baked in nearby kitchens, were stacked in baskets. A thin drizzle of butter gleamed on top, its aroma drifting into the crisp evening air. The contradiction is enough to make the viewer pause, caught between disbelief and anger. Soldiers at the front, the men risking death in the Ardennes or slogging through the mud in Italy, struggled to choke down dry, joyless rations. Yet here, thousands of miles from the fighting, prisoners who had fired on them days or weeks before were eating hot food that smelled of home. It was no accident. By 1943, the United States had committed itself to the Geneva Convention, determined to show the world it would not descend into the barbarity its enemies practiced. Feeding prisoners well was a political message as much as a moral decision. But to the men on the ground, to those in muddy foxholes, it looked like a bitter irony the enemy had stew, while they had crumbs. Imagine the moment through the eyes of Private Harold Keane of the 84th Infantry, crouched in Belgium with frostbitten fingers wrapped around a frozen can of beans. His letter to his wife, preserved in archives, reads, "They tell us the Jerrys back in Texas are being given meat stew and bread. Here, I'd trade my rifle for a spoonful." Whether his words were half joking or wholly serious is lost to time, but the resentment was real. And yet, inside those camps, the prisoners themselves often ate in stunned silence. For many, the stew was the first proper meal they had seen in months. Memories of gnawing on moldy black bread at Stalingrad or chewing frozen horse meat on the Eastern Front lingered in their minds. A German sergeant, scribbling in a diary confiscated years later, put it plainly: "We expected punishment, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, we received hot soup." This was harder to understand than defeat itself. So the opening question stands, hanging in the smoky air of the camp kitchen, waiting for the viewer to answer, why should a prisoner eat better than the soldier who captured him? The year was 1945, and the war had entered its final grinding phase. Europe lay in ruins. And yet the machinery of conflict demanded more than bullets and tanks. It demanded food on the American side. Feeding an army that stretched across 2 oceans had already strained supply lines to the limit. Soldiers in the Ardennes or on the Italian front often lived on half rations because convoys stalled in mud or were destroyed by Luftwaffe raids. Letters from GIs, home to Kansas or Ohio, carried the same refrain: the food was monotonous, cold, and insufficient. One infantryman wrote simply, "We fight on empty stomachs, with dreams of coffee and eggs." And yet, thousands of miles away, in the heartland of the United States, German prisoners of war were living a different reality. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was unambiguous. Prisoners must receive the same quality and quantity of food as the troops of the detaining power. For the United States, a nation eager to prove its moral high ground, compliance was not optional. Every camp kitchen was a stage, every meal a declaration. America would not starve its captives, it would feed them. That decision created paradoxes impossible to ignore. In camps across Texas, Iowa, and Nebraska, POWs filed into mess halls where industrial kitchens boiled vats of stew, roasted chickens, and baked bread daily. These meals often matched the caloric needs of American garrisons at home. Meanwhile, at the front, supply officers scrawled desperate reports of shortages, in some cases, Logistics officers admitted candidly that prisoners in camps were eating more calories than infantry in the field. The contrast was more than numbers. It was lived experience. At Camp Swift in Texas, German soldiers remembered the shock of being served potatoes and meat in thick gravy, a meal their comrades on the Eastern Front would have killed for. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners even worked in canning factories, surrounded by mountains of produce destined for both military and civilian tables. Some joked, half in disbelief, that they had been captured by a cook rather than by the U.S. Army. The public, too, noticed. Newspapers carried quiet reports of POWs well fed in Midwestern camps, and reactions varied from pride to anger. Some citizens saw it as proof of American decency, evidence that even in total war, democracy did not compromise its values. Others fumed that enemy soldiers were eating steak while ration coupons at home barely secured dried beans. The tension only deepened among the soldiers themselves, for a frontline GI subsisting on cold Spam and biscuits. The knowledge that his captured enemy was eating hot stew was a bitter pill, and, for the prisoner, spooning the thick broth into his mouth. The experience carried its own psychological weight. Defeat had brought them into camps, but defeat had also delivered them to tables more generous than those offered by the Reich. This was the paradox of 1945, American abundance colliding with German scarcity, morality colliding with resentment. In every ladle of stew poured in a quiet Midwestern camp kitchen, the war's contradictions simmered to the surface. The expectation of suffering was universal. From the moment German troops surrendered on European battlefields, many believed that captivity in America would mean starvation, humiliation, perhaps even retribution for the atrocities committed under the Nazi banner. Tales from the Eastern Front haunted them, horror stories of Soviet camps where prisoners froze and withered away in the snow, their rations barely a crust of bread. For those captured by the United States, fear of the unknown gnawed at them during long voyages across the Atlantic. They whispered among themselves on crowded transport ships, wondering if the Americans would seek revenge. Audiences today might share that instinctive expectation. We imagine barbed wire, gaunt faces, the metallic clang of empty soup pots. It seems logical, surely the enemy, especially the enemy that had bombed London or fought tooth and nail in Normandy, would be treated with cruelty. The cinematic script almost writes itself harsh guards, thin broth, a hunger that lingers day and night. This is the image of captivity that fits the world's expectation of war. But that image would soon fracture. When the first German POWs were marched into camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin or Camp Bowie in Texas, they braced for misery. Instead, they were greeted by orderly kitchens, mess halls large enough to serve hundreds at a time, and American cooks stirring vast cauldrons of food. The smell alone was disorienting: onions sautéing in butter, meat simmering with potatoes, the yeasty aroma of bread rising in ovens. To men who had grown accustomed to gnawing dry crusts in foxholes, it was almost a hallucination. One anecdote captures the irony perfectly. A German lieutenant, writing secretly in his diary, confessed that he had rehearsed speeches of defiance for the moment his captors would mistreat him. But on his first night in camp, he was handed a full tray stew, bread, coffee, even a slice of pie. I could not summon my anger, he wrote. Instead, I ate like a child. That private admission, buried in the pages of his diary, reveals how fragile the walls of hatred became when confronted with simple hospitality. Meanwhile, American guards themselves struggled to process the paradox. Some muttered that it made no sense to serve hearty meals to men who had been trying to kill them weeks earlier, yet regulations were clear, and supplies flowed steadily. The Army, determined to display its compliance with international law, ordered that German prisoners be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Food was the front line of that policy. For the POWs, each meal became a silent drama. Could they trust the stew? Was it a trick, a form of psychological warfare? Slowly, suspicion gave way to reluctant gratitude, though many dared not admit it aloud. Within the barracks, whispers circulated. The Americans feed us better than our own army ever did. Some dismissed it as propaganda, but the evidence was in their stomachs. Thus the stage was set for the shocking reversal the moment when captives realized that captivity did not mean hunger, but abundance. And for the audience watching today, the tension builds. If this is not the story of deprivation, then what deeper paradox is waiting to unfold? The reversal came in the most ordinary of moments when the ladle dipped into the pot and clattered against the rim. German prisoners, lined up in neat rows, moved slowly forward, their breath misting in the cool evening air. They expected a watery broth, perhaps a crust of bread, just enough to keep them alive. Instead, the smell struck them first rich, savory, layered with meat and vegetables that had simmered for hours. Into each dented metal tray fell thick stew, chunks of beef, tender enough to pull apart with a spoon, carrots soft and sweet, potatoes soaking up the broth, onions melting into flavor. Some men stared in disbelief, as though the food itself were a trick. Then came the baskets of bread, golden loaves still warm from the oven, their crusts cracking open with steam. Coffee followed, poured into tin cups that warmed their hands, for soldiers who had eaten moldy crusts on the march or gnawed frozen horse meat outside Stalingrad. The experience was almost overwhelming. Accounts from the time capture this sensory shock. At Camp Bowie in Texas, one prisoner wrote in a letter smuggled home, "We eat stew with meat every evening. I do not exaggerate. Yesterday, even fresh rolls." Another recalled the taste of butter for the first time in years. He held the small pat in his hand, staring as though it were treasure. In the barracks afterward, the men whispered, some laughing bitterly, others silent. No one had imagined that defeat could taste like comfort. But the shock was not limited to the prisoners. Word spread among American soldiers still in the field, and their reactions carried equal weight. A corporal in France wrote angrily to his brother, "They tell us the Germans in Kansas are getting beef stew. Out here, we get cans of hash so hard you need a bayonet to open them." The resentment was sharp, born from the bitter truth that captives were eating better than the men risking their lives for the prisoners. Though, each meal was an unexpected collision between memory and reality. They remembered their own rations: black bread, ersatz coffee, thin cabbage soup, and they compared it silently to what now filled their trays. The food was not luxury by American standards, but in their eyes, it was abundance beyond measure. One guard later recalled the look on their faces. It wasn't joy, it was confusion, maybe even shame. They didn't know whether to eat fast or stare at the bowl, and so the contradiction deepened. Each ladle of stew told a story of logistics, morality, and power. America's ability to feed even its enemies with a generosity the Reich could never match. For the prisoners, it was not just nourishment. It was proof that the world they had been told to believe in was crumbling, replaced by one they could hardly comprehend. Reactions inside and outside the camps revealed the full absurdity of the paradox. For the German prisoners, each steaming bowl of stew carried not just warmth, but dissonance. Many ate quickly, head down, as if ashamed to be enjoying such comfort while their comrades were still starving on the front. In the barracks afterward, whispers rippled between bunks. Some men confessed, almost guiltily, that the stew tasted better than anything they had eaten in the Wehrmacht. Others refused to admit it aloud, worried it would sound like betrayal of the fatherland. The silence was telling kindness from the enemy unsettled them more deeply than bullets had. At the same time, American soldiers at the front wrestled with their own feelings. They heard rumors through letters or Red Cross updates, prisoners in Texas eating meat stew while GIs in Belgium choked down cold Spam. The bitterness grew sharper with every meal eaten from a dented tin. "Why should they eat better than us?" one sergeant muttered in a report filed from the Ardennes. The irony stung. Men risking death were treated to rations that sapped their morale. While the enemy who had surrendered lived with fuller stomachs, this tension created a strange inversion. The prisoners, though physically fed, bore the shame of being cared for by their enemy. The soldiers, though free and armed, bore the sting of resentment toward the very prisoners they had captured. Each group envied something the other held: safety or dignity, freedom or nourishment. War's logic collapsed into contradictions, and stew, of all things, became the symbol of that collapse. The gossip within the camps grew rich with irony. Prisoners joked bitterly about sending postcards to their comrades at the front, boasting of stew and bread. One diary fragment recorded a sarcastic line, "Perhaps I should surrender again tomorrow. Dinner is at 6. Such humor masked unease. For many, the meal was a reminder that their government had failed them not only in strategy, but in the most basic human duty to feed its soldiers. Meanwhile, in small-town America, Citizens whispered their own complaints. Housewives standing in ration lines wondered aloud why German POWs were receiving beef while their families lived on meat coupons. Politicians received letters demanding to know why enemy bellies were filled, while loyal Americans tightened their belts. Feeding prisoners had become not just a moral act, but a political balancing act, stirring envy and discontent on both sides of the wire. And so the paradox deepened, stretching across oceans and battle lines. The stew soothed hunger but unsettled minds, raising a question that still lingers: who truly bore the heavier burden, those fighting and starving, or those defeated but fed? Now, a question for you watching today: if you were a soldier at the front, hearing your enemy ate better than you, how would you feel? Share your thoughts below. I'd like to know how you weigh justice, irony, and the strange arithmetic of war. The stew pot was more than a meal. It was a metaphor, simmering with meanings that reached far beyond the camp fence. Each ladle poured into a prisoner's tray represented America's immense logistical power, the ability to ship wheat from Kansas, beef from Nebraska, and vegetables from Iowa, all while still supplying its own civilians and armies scattered across 2 continents. No Axis nation could rival such abundance. The Reich, by 1944, was grinding acorns into flour and watering down ersatz coffee. In contrast, America could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its allies. Statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. By 1945, the United States produced nearly 200 million bushels of wheat, while German harvests collapsed under Allied bombing and labor shortages. American canneries packed thousands of tons of vegetables each week, and meatpacking plants processed millions of cattle annually in one Midwestern facility. Records show that a single day's production of canned stew outpaced what German supply chains could deliver to entire divisions on the Eastern Front. For every hungry German soldier shivering in the snow, a POW in Texas or Wisconsin spooned hot broth from a bowl. Prisoners themselves recognized the symbolism. Some wrote, cautiously, that the real weapon America wielded was not its Sherman tanks or B-17 bombers, but its food. One recalled watching crates of flour stacked higher than the camp barracks, whispering to a fellow captive, "This is why we lost. They can make bread without end." Even the act of baking loaves became a quiet display of power, an everyday ritual that carried a psychological weight no propaganda leaflet could match. The stew pot also embodied something deeper: humanity as strategy. To treat prisoners decently was not weakness, it was theater for the world. By honoring the Geneva Convention so openly, America positioned itself as morally superior to the Reich in every steaming meal. There was an unspoken message: we are strong enough to feed even those who fought against us. For the prisoners, that reality cut sharper than defeat in battle. It forced comparisons with their own homeland, where rations grew thinner and propaganda promised plenty that never arrived. Among American soldiers, resentment lingered, but some also saw the bigger picture. A lieutenant in charge of camp logistics noted in his report, "The food is not for their comfort, it is for our reputation." He understood what the prisoners were beginning to grasp. Stew was diplomacy, as potent as treaties signed in marble halls. And so the pot boiled on, feeding thousands while symbolizing millions. For the Germans, it was a daily reminder of defeat and of a world richer than they had been told existed. For America, it was proof that strength could be measured not only in bombs dropped, but in calories served. To you watching now, I'll ask directly, do you think kindness in war is a form of strength, or is it a dangerous luxury? Comment below. I'd like to hear where you stand on this paradox. By 1946, the camps were emptying. German prisoners boarded trains, clutching small bundles of belongings, their uniforms threadbare from years behind wire. Yet what many carried most vividly was not the memory of guard towers or roll calls, it was the taste of stew, the smell of bread, the shock of being treated as men rather than as enemies. Diaries recovered decades later reveal how deeply these meals marked them. One soldier wrote that he still dreamed of the American bread that cracked warm in my hands. Another admitted that the camp kitchen changed the way I saw the world more than the front ever did. The irony persisted. Veterans of the Wehrmacht returned to ruined cities where their families queued for meager rations. They told stories of America's abundant stories their neighbors struggled to believe. for those who had lived through the hunger of Berlin or Dresden. The idea that prisoners in Texas once ate beef stew sounded like fantasy. And yet it was true. The contradiction itself became part of the legacy. The defeated had glimpsed a kind of prosperity the victors themselves often envied. American guards, too, remembered. Some spoke years later of the uneasy feeling that they had watched enemy soldiers eat more heartily than their own brothers still fighting in Europe. Others confessed that the act of feeding, of ladling stew day after day, softened something in them. War demanded hatred, but the kitchen often undermined it with the simple smell of food. The stew pot became a symbol that lingered far beyond the camps. It was an emblem of logistics, proof of industrial might, but also a vessel of paradox. In its broth swirled the contradictions of war cruelty and kindness, scarcity and abundance, resentment and gratitude. A prisoner tasting butter for the first time in years was not just a man being fed, he was a witness to the scale of America's power and the fragility of his own nation's promises. And so the lesson hardened into memory: war is never fair, never logical, sometimes. It is more comfortable to be a captive than a soldier, sometimes. Defeat feeds you more than victory, and sometimes. The strongest weapon is not the gun or the bomb, but the quiet insistence on humanity. As the final trains pulled away, the smell of stew faded from the camp kitchens. Yet for thousands of men, its aftertaste endured for a lifetime. The story of the prison camp kitchens is not one of recipes or menus. It is a story of paradox, of human fragility revealed in the most ordinary acts. War had taught men to expect cruelty, to believe that victory was measured in violence, yet in the quiet rhythm of a ladle striking the rim of a pot. Another truth emerged: that power can be shown not only in fire and steel, but in bread and broth. For the prisoners, the memory of stew became inseparable from their memory of America. Some carried it home to families in bombed-out houses, whispering about meals their neighbors could not imagine. Others held onto it in silence, ashamed that kindness from an enemy had pierced their armor of ideology more deeply than defeat itself. And for the Americans' guards, cooks, supply officers, the act of feeding became a mirror. It forced them to ask whether strength was best expressed by how an enemy was fought, or how an enemy was treated after the fighting was done. History often records battles and body counts, but rarely does it dwell on kitchens. Yet in those kitchens lay a quiet power, the ability to change perception with a single bowl of food. A rivet gun might build a bomber in 60 minutes, but a stew pot could dismantle years of hatred in the time it took to eat. Decades later, one former prisoner admitted he still dreamed of the smell of onions sizzling in butter. That detail, so small, outlived the speeches of generals and the thunder of artillery. It reminds us that humanity's true victories are sometimes written not in treaties or monuments, but in the fleeting warmth of a meal shared when none was expected. So let us leave this story with an image: a line of weary men, once enemies, bent over steaming bowls of stew as night fell on a camp in Texas. No banners waved, no trumpets sounded, only silence, only steam, only the fragile truth that kindness leaves echoes where violence cannot.